Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of radio as a medium. Here's your host, Ron.
Hello and welcome to Radio Dayz, the podcast. Of course, you can hear this podcast on BuzzZsprout and all the major podcast platforms, and you can also watch this show via YouTube and at ronrobinsonstudios.com. Very excited about this week's show as we're going to welcome a Detroit rock radio legend. But before we get to that special guest we got coming up today, I want to share with you as to why I produce this podcast. I've made no secret. Fred Jacobs actually gave me the idea to do this. It's to promote the upcoming docuseries movie that I've produced about the history of radio. Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio, chronicles the history of radio from its early beginnings through radio serials to the emergence of music and rock and roll through the advent of FM radio taking over the airwaves, all the way to current radio programming. Hear the stories from those who lived it. Among the personalities that appear in this docuseries, Dick Burton, Ken Calvert, Paul W. Smith, Doug Podell, JoJo Shuddy McGregor, Fred Jacobs, Jill Forsyth, Art Regner, John O'Leary, Duke Facour, Greg Henson, Chuck Santoni, Greg Russell, Brian Pastoria, Michael Persh, Karen D'Alessandro, and many, many more. So to learn more about this docuseries, head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com. You're going to like this. Check it out. In this episode, which is brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group and Radio Dayz the Movie, today we're going to take a dive into the radio career of one Trudi Daniels. So without further ado, here is the legend herself, Thee Trudi Daniels. Hey, Trudi, how are you?
I'm great. I'm honored to be among all of those great radio actual legends. And how you doing? Thanks for inviting me, Ryan.
Of course, you know what? I don't know you there very well, but from the people I've talked to that do know you a little bit better than I do, you're very humble. But I don't know. If you grew up in the Detroit area and you listened to the radio back then, which was much more prominent, which we'll get to, I think you'd fall into that category of legend. Come on.
Thanks.
If when someone says Trudi Daniels to me, you know, in my head, you know what I say? Riff Rock Radio News. I mean,
yeah,
it's instant. It's like
Radio News.
Riff Rock Radio News. Yeah. I mean, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
so as we mentioned, I'm sorry.
It was brilliant.
Yeah. It rolled off the tongue, and that's an
happened.
aspect of what you do that I want to talk about here in a little bit. But before we get, it's what I do with the show is I delve into the career of everybody because everybody knows, the radio people, what stations they like. But there's a big long, road to that. Before you were on Riff, you were at several radio stations. We're going to get to that. But before we get to the early days of radio, I want to. Right now, you're doing a lot of stuff. Radio's keeping you pretty busy. Right here in 2023, between radio and podcasting. Yeah. Talk about what you're working on, because you're one of those few guests who are still working in radio actively.
Well, I start out my day at about 8:30 here at Wheels, iHeart Radio, and that, of course, came on the air about 4 years ago. It'll be 4 years, March 1st, and it was just an intrepid adventure to come into rock and roll and handle like both ends of it. 70s, 80s, and then 90s. And so we've done that for 4 years. I do middays. Wow. I love it. I never knew how to jock a show before I came in here. I was part of an ensemble.
That's much different than what you were doing, right? Much different than what you were used to.
I was part of an ensemble with a Drew and Mike show, so I'd really never, aside from doing a little bit of Traverse City, I'd really never done a show by myself. So it was a learning experience on the job, on the fly. And then I cut out at about 2, have some lunch, and then go to Ferndale and do the Drew and Mike show, which everybody's familiar with. We did that show for 23 years. We're still doing it. People are always telling me, I love that show. And I'm like, hey, it's still there. So
it's still on, yes. And you're still making great radio. And I do have some questions later on, but I like to go in a, chronological manner. But before we get to your career in radio, I always like to start off the interviews by asking folks, way before you got into radio, what is your earliest memory of listening to the radio?
That's a good question, because I never thought I'd end up here, but I did remember going to concerts as a teenager. I love going to concerts, and I was in Cleveland at a World Series of Rock, and Betty Corvan from WMMS was up on stage, and she was bringing the band on. I forget what band it was. but it was probably like Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, that one. And I was like, that's pretty cool because you can do rock and roll, still love going to concerts and stuff like that, and then have a job in it. So
Yeah.
that was kind of my first. I used to listen to CKLW too, like everybody did around this area, and I would listen for hours to try to request a song. And now all of that is coming at me. People calling to request songs. It's weird how it's full circle, but.
You mentioned one of my next question was, who were you listening to? You mentioned CKLW. Do you remember some of the personalities? Because CKLW is very interesting because and your background is in news, but as popular as it was because of Rosalie and the songs being played, it was also garnering listeners to an aspect of radio that other stations, it was a tune out, and that's 2020 News. It was like a bionic station. But as far as personalities, do you remember people that you like listening to, even if it wasn't
Byron
CK?
McGregor. I mean, the dude was legend. I was before I actually started in radio, I worked at a bank for a while, and remember driving in listening to CKLW because it was in the dead zone of Ohio, and so not much came in, and so I'd listen to CKLW and listen to Byron McGregor, 2020 News. If it bleeds, it leads. I know that wasn't his. He didn't make that famous, but that was kind of his deal. And it was such a mystery what was going on up here in Detroit. But I listened to that.
I always like to say that Byron McGregor and the other guys in the 2020 newsroom made Detroit sound like Gotham City.
No, it was true. It's true. And when I was in college, though, then I got to see I got the flip side of it. I listened to Riff. Back in the day, it was Jim and George. George Bear and Jim Johnson. And, they had that like parrot sidekick that they did, which is just one of, I think, George Bear's voices. And I was just like, what the hell is all this stuff? It's so, it's kind of weird. I hadn't really, as a kid, a lot of people start out when they're like 14. Jay Towers down the hallway was like, I started radio when I was 15, but it was still a mystery to me. When I went to college, I wasn't sure at Bowling Green. I wasn't sure that I'd actually do this, and then all of a sudden, there I am, in it.
Well, and let's start from the beginning. Obviously, you're a fan of radio. You grew up listening to it, but that's a far cry from getting involved as an occupation.
Right.
When and how did you pursue your first gig in radio, and how did you have an epiphany? You were like, or was it just kind of bounce into it? How did you and the job of radio intertwine?
I fell into it. I interned. Well, so I took up broadcasting in college because a professor said, "Hey, I was going to write. I was going to do newspaper. Thank God." Sorry, no offense against newspaper, but it's not its finest hour. But yeah, so I was, and my professor was like, "Hey, it's kind of big in broadcasting for women right now." So I made that my course of study and pursued all of that and took all the, like studio training and ended up at WTOL in Toledo doing a TV internship for the summer. And upstairs was WIOT. And coincidentally, the person
in Toledo, right?
Yep,
That's
in Toledo. And just coincidentally, Jane Perry was leaving her job to go to law school, and I fell into that job.
Wow.
So my first job was with Buck McWilliams. We did a morning show together. First radio gig that I'd ever done doing a morning show. And it was pretty crazy.
What do you remember about that time? Because it must seem like a lifetime ago, as many jobs as you've had since then.
It is. It's not that far away, though. But I just remember... like I was pretty serious about news back then,
Right.
I took it very seriously, and then, eventually rock and roll radio wouldn't be into it anymore, but it took a little while to sort of get into the whole having a partner sort of thing and being a sidekick, but it was I remember all of it. It was great. It was a good time. We, did a lot of appearances at bars and stuff like that. And
Now, I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself. Where did you grow up?
Sandusky, Ohio.
Okay, so not too far from Toledo.
Yeah. Well, and so I was kind of in that like sweet zone between Toledo and Cleveland. So I listened to both. Both of those were my rock and roll experience growing up.
I know a lot of kids my age would be like, "You're lucky you lived by Cedar Point." Right?
Yeah.
All right. So moving on. That was in 82. You got hired at WLVQ in Columbus, where you served as news director and air personality. How did this opportunity present itself?
Yeah, so Bowling Green was kind of my connection with that. The guy that I would eventually partner with there went to Bowling Green, and so he was on the morning show. His name is Pat Still. People around here might remember him. He worked for Riff doing the morning show for a while. Pat and Wags were one of the interim morning shows, and he and the program or the general manager were both Falcons. And I don't know, they just called me up and asked me if I wanted to do it. I think there was a consultant who was sort of, like the go-between, who heard me and thought it would be a good fit. And so, again, the person who did the news was leaving for another career. And so, again, I fell into another job in Columbus. And
now,
that was fun.
I've heard of Columbus, but how big compare it to a Michigan city on how big of a market it is?
The Columbus market, I don't think it's as big as the Cleveland market. It's certainly not as big as Detroit. I don't know if it was in the 20s, maybe.
Okay.
The weird thing about
so
it,
maybe
though,
like like Grand Rapids, maybe Grand Rapids. Maybe.
I guess, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, LVQ is a great rock station. I mean, they've been around for a really long time. So they're one of the best, like LVQ and TUE and Dayton were great rock stations, great heritage rock stations back then. But yeah, it was probably a mid-market move.
Now, one thing that struck me about that stop is it was your second job. And I contend that you learn more from your second job than you do your first job because you kind of evolved and get it. You're like, okay, this works, this doesn't work. But what stuck with me is that you were there for 8 years. 8 years is a long time for a second job. Talk to me about why you were there that long and how your role maybe evolved at the station.
I think at that time, radio morning shows, were kind of solid. It was just one of those things that if you developed one, people stuck with it. It was more profitable than, venturing out. And my theory is that was sort of the beginning of the era of the morning show.
Right.
And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was fun there, and I think Pat and Wags were great partners. Pat went somewhere else, and both Pat and Wags came up here, ironically, to Detroit, and that's when they started putting other hosts in. As I remember, Ron, I'm glad you asked that question because now they started, experimenting with other people in the role of the host. And I guess it just wasn't, the same. So
sure.
I heard from somebody else and I ended up in Sacramento after that.
That's what I was going to ask you about. That's the move that I'm really curious about. You leave Ohio, which is your home. Now you're going to California. How did this opportunity present itself? And was that a no-brainer for you at the time?
That actually happened through another consultant who hit me up sort of on the sly, and he goes, "Hey, you want to go out there?" The radio station was KZAP. That was another one of those great heritage rock stations. There's a little bit of an issue, though, with the way I was hired in, and I ended up staying there for about a month and kind of wondering what I was going to do with myself. It was a complicated situation. I don't even know if I'm at liberty to talk about, but I ended up, kind of walking the dog all day long and the baby in the stroller. And then Great American, which then became J-Corps, which is, it was Taft Broadcasting. I mean, it'd been a lot of things. And they're like, "Hey, we heard that you don't have a job." They were the people that I left in Columbus, and they hired me again at their station in Sacramento. So
that's what I was curious about, is because how many radio stations in California know about an Ohio news person? I mean, that was just, so that makes sense. But you were only there for like a cup of coffee because like 4 or 5 months, and then you went across the country to WZOU. You explain to me why you were there for only a short time, and then how that opportunity landed itself across the country from Sacramento to Boston. That's a trek.
So when they hired me at back at the Great American Radio Station. I forget what the original call letters are.
Wasn't it
was a hot hit.
KSEG? KSEG, I think.
It turned into KSEG.
Okay.
So it actually had a format flip while I was there. And my co-host, John Edwards, and I did that for a little while. And then he got a job offer in Boston. And then he asked me if I wanted to go along. And I traipsed all the way across the country with a kid, like 3 years old at the time, and set up shop in Boston. So
wow,
yeah,
that's
and that was for only like about a year. But man, Boston, what a great city that is.
Yeah,
you can never, get to as many restaurants as there are in Boston.
As someone who grew up in
it was fleeting.
As someone who grew up in the Midwest, what was it like to live there? It had to be culture shock a bit, no? It's different.
It was great living there. I mean, I vacationed there a couple of times in the past, so I knew it was just a beautiful place to be, a great culture. The one thing that was kind of funny is that it's a little bit of a conceit. They didn't think civilization existed west of the borders of Massachusetts, and so you'd say, "Yeah, I'm from Ohio," and boy, I mean. If you say I'm from Ohio here in Michigan, there's kind of a look that you get. But,
right.
Just imagine being in Boston. I mean, I don't know if they thought it was a civilized part of the country.
Animals, heathens
but it
over
was
there.
Fun. It was a good time.
Yeah. So I want to stick with Boston because this was like the late 80s, early 90s, right?
Yeah, I think it was like maybe 90. Like 89 to 90. So, yeah.
So you were there. So also on-air talent and news director at that station as well?
Yeah. Doing the same thing. Co-host morning show with John Edwards. Johnny in the Morning is what he called himself, what the name of the show was. And then I got another job inquiry, in about it was maybe 2 years. And it was to come back to Detroit. And
a little station called, what's that station? I think WRIF, isn't that the station? Am I thinking right?
Came to work with Rip. And before I made up my mind, they invited me to come into town and meet Drew. And I just remember it was like it was in November, and it was right around, I guess, Thanksgiving. And so I came in, and my parents lived in Ohio, so they met me up here and had dinner. And then the next day I went to hang out and meet Drew. And, I just remember like being kind of uptight, like I wasn't sure where he was coming from and all of that. And
right.
He was absolutely just the most, the most outgoing, fun, hilarious person. And, but first I'm like, oh God, where's this guy coming from? And he was asking me some of the bits that we did on the air in Boston. And so I'm telling him we used to do like a Dr. Kevorkian bit. And he goes, oh, I'm not judging you. I'm just trying to steal bits from you. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go along just fine. I like this.
These are questions that I had for later on when we come full circle, but I'm going to ask my Drew Lane questions now since you brought him up. In 2000, well, I'll get to that in a second. For Drew Lane, I think if there's a Mount Rushmore for entertaining broadcasters, to me, he's on it. And I just want to ask you, from someone who's worked on it. I mean, he does so many. Any one given topic in the hands of Drew Lane to me is like Play-Doh. He builds like 8 things with it before he puts it away. It's just I don't think he gets enough respect for being a radio broadcaster. Getting to work. Explain that.
Yeah, and it's never in the direction that you think it's going to go, or in the direction that any other radio show might take it. He has that gift of thinking about a thing from a different point of view. So, like a lot of people use prep services to do their show. Drew would never approach anything from that angle, and it was always the most unique look at a topic. And the other thing that he's just amazing at is interviewing people on the fly.
Oh.
I mean, he could always just roll with anybody on the phone. We have excerpts of the show that we use on the podcast, and I remember us talking to Gary Coleman. And And he just like, he just wasn't having it. And it was another, stupid radio show interrupting his job. And he just let us have it. And I just remember, like Drew acting kind of wounded and affronted that he was mad. And then Clark, of course, wrapping it up with "you little."
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. That was brilliant radio. And if I'm not mistaken, that was they called him about the time that the Kid Rock video came out that he was in it, if I'm not mistaken. But I want to say, growing up in the Detroit area, that was you guys, the Drew and Mike show with Trudi Daniels, that was must listen to radio because every day was different. And and to me, the fact that Howard Stern never caught on in Detroit is because of the Drew and Mike show. Period. He blew up everywhere else except for here. Even when they brought him in at 97.1.
Right. And you know what? All the credit goes to the people who listened and how faithful and loyal they were. And to this day, you'll meet people who listened to us back then. They listened to the podcast. Now they'll show up at some of our events and they have their kids with them. Like, a guy who started listening with his mom and, or somebody who started listening with their dad our show wasn't very clean, but
I don't think you could do it like that today. I don't know.
Maybe not. I don't know. Morning shows are kind of a different area. They're sort of a different animal. But yeah, sure. After the Super Bowl with Janet Jackson, they did clamp down on morning shows a bit. I don't know why we got in trouble for that, but we did.
That was weird. Radio got to blame for that. But if I'm in a bad mood and I need to laugh, I have it on my computer. I pull up the Belford Blows clip. To me, that was the funniest fucking thing I had ever heard. That was the kind of stuff that pull over the side of the road, whether it be Kramer Blows. Belford Blows, arguably probably the best one, just because just whoever was ringing that bell, it was just like a comedy orgasmic experience. It's like ding, Belford Blows, ding, ding. But yeah, it was brilliant radio. But that was just one. The Harrises, the Harris. Oh my gosh, I still remember on April Fools when he gave him shit like, "Why the fuck are you still calling me? What do you have nothing better to?" You remember that? When he gave him the business and they were like, and I don't know, Drew might have been acting, but to me, it was like he chastised them. They're like, well, we just thought you enjoyed these conversations like we did. But it was brilliant. But stuff like that. It was, and you never knew day in, day out what was gonna be funny, but you knew if you tuned into 101.1, you're gonna laugh your ass off.
Yeah, well, it was entirely organic too. No one pre-wrote anything. We all acted as an ensemble, and yeah. There were certain things that were pre-recorded. Of course, you remember Cliff Notes Theater, all those brilliant productions that were put together. But yeah, it was.
I want to bring up. I want to bring up something that you actually brought to the table because it's not a second thought now, but at the time, I think it's depicted in Howard Stern's movie. Speaking of him, but it was not that common for the news people to talk to the disc jockeys. So. Right. It wasn't like you were stealing that's the way it was. That was different. Which leads me to my next question. When and how did you pair up with Drew and Mike? And how long before you guys, okay, this format that we're doing, rinse, repeat, just keep doing it over. When did you realize, okay, this is how we're supposed to do it?
Well, that was an evolution, actually. I hooked up with them in 91. They had been at it and it was True and Zip, and they'd been at it for a couple of months before I came in. And they, and again, because Lynn Woodison didn't want to do it, I got that job. It's always because somebody in the news person role was going on to something else moving forward, and I got the gig. But, but we first started out playing more music than we did bits. And it was a while, too, before I feel like Detroit was ready to accept us. But I remember being at a St. Patrick's Day party. It may have been that same March in, 1991. I came in January. And we were downriver at a bar, and all of a sudden we heard people, yelling out drops and stuff. Like we had used on the show. And it was like, oh, right. Wow, okay. They're on board. And it was that kind of loyalty to, the show, listening to the show and then repeating it back and being on board with all the bits And I realized that we were there. And then we did the show for quite a while. And then little by little, my news just started to be part of it because, like it sort of interacted. It wasn't just a news segment, but they interacted. And I always kind of look for things like that anyway. I wasn't trying to do bummer news or deep, but also stuff with substance, but stuff that you can make a joke out of in the end. So that might have a punchline that they could throw in.
Can you tell me when and where you were when you realized that you lost your, being anonymous? You realized, oh my gosh, people know who I am. That had to be weird. First time.
Wow. I don't know if I can. I do know that at some point along the line, I stopped wearing like pajama pants and stuff to stores and going out without makeup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause I was just like, oh, you never know when somebody's going to see you and go, yeah. And then you end up in the National Enquirer.
Oh, yeah. Well, nobody wants that.
And that feature they have for people who are caught without their makeup.
Well, if not for that, then let me ask you this: when did you realize? And you kind of gave me an example of that just now. But when did you realize that not only were you recognizable, but oh my gosh, we're really onto something here. This is bigger than just a successful morning show.
I think it was within the first year. I mean, I think it really caught fire. We had some like kick-ass interviews. I mean, Joe Walsh and Glenn Fry flew in to do our show, completely without sleep and possibly inebriated. I mean, John Mellencamp did our show. So, that kind of stuff brings people in to listen and then they're hooked. And I guess, I don't know, it was probably within the first year. I kind of go by what building we were in at the time. And we were in that building in Southfield. And it was pretty early in the game, but it evolved in so many different ways after that too. So just never stopped growing.
I have to ask you this, and you could tell me to pound sand, and maybe it's a secret if you don't want to tell me. But I've always wondered how you guys, and I'm sure it was probably Drew, but who knows? It could have been a producer, or it could have been yourself. How did you guys get the phone numbers of these hotels that these celebrities were in? And there was countless ones that you guys would cold call somebody, and then say you guys were supposed to have a meeting, and it's just you're lying to these people. And how did you did that come from the listeners, or how did you guys? Go ahead.
Oh, like John Madden?
Yeah, John Madden. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you could just look those up. It's just a phone call to information, and it was kind of before computers were super effective. But you just called information, got the hotel, and then called the front desk. And the art of it is in bluffing your way through.
Yes.
And it worked. It doesn't so much anymore. They're kind of onto it. But
it's getting like when you turn into some of these morning shows and they're doing, like stuff that Dick Burton used to do with I mean, I still listen to that Porsche call. You've heard that one, haven't you? The Porsche call. That's the put on call that really made him famous. I'd check that out if I were you. But no, I don't want to get off topic because you and I could go off on a tangent. But I want to ask you, because we've talked about the Harris poll, Belfer blows, cold call celebrities. Do you have a favorite bit or a favorite reoccurring theme that you guys you just had a ball doing? I mean, I'm sure they were all fun, but do you have one that you look back with more fondness than the others? I
mean, they did a lot more of the bits, and I kind of came in and like was in the middle of it. But I have to think, like we're on the air one day, and I think somebody in either the newspaper or somebody accused us of being radio for people who don't have jobs. So this was just, it wasn't even a bit that was intended. It just it springs out of somebody making that sort of insult, and Drew going on the air and asking people, what's your job? Give us a call. And then we ended up having all kinds of people call in, and they're like, I work at such and such hospital and I listen to you guys. And the phone calls were hilarious. They were great. And I think the audience interaction was part of my favorite part, because again, that was completely unscripted, organic, It just happened. And people contributed as much to that show as we did. The other part was people calling in and making a collect call for, hey, would you blow me? Leaving a collect call, what's your name? And the person would leave their name. Hey, would you blow me? It's hard to describe something as spontaneous as that, but
before we leave the Drew and Mike era from the Riff days, what was that last show like? Was that a hard show to do, knowing you guys are number one in the market, kicking ass, and this was going to be your last hurrah at Riff? What was that? That must have been very bittersweet.
It was like, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident and you're stunned to the point of actually there's some sort of kind of numbness and you're just kind of walking through it. It felt like that. It was very sad. Just
now,
really...
how long do you remember how long you guys were told before your last show, and what was that like working there, knowing that you were like, dead man walking type of situation?
I think.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I don't know, you just come in and do the same thing.
Yeah. So what did you do after that? I mean, 2013, you go from being the number one show to now, you're not working in radio. What did you do with yourself? Was there opportunities that you turned down? What did you do with yourself after the Drew and Mike show went off the air?
I almost immediately got, when they announced that they were going in a different direction, the radio station down the hall wondered if I wanted to come over there. And so after our last day, that's what I did. I picked up and went to WCSX.
Wow. And how, obviously a big difference in your job duties. How did that change for you professionally? Obviously you're not part of a number one show anymore, but.
Well, nor part of an ensemble, but I got to work with the great Ken Calvert, who was incredibly welcoming and warm. And there's so much, I mean, I don't remember growing up with Ken Calvert because I was out of the market. So there was a lot to discover about Ken Calvert and, like the kind of bits that Ken was into and his humor. And so that was a whole new experience for me. And he's great. He's really, he's also not one of those people who's super carried away with himself.
Right.
Even though he's interviewed almost everyone in the free world. When he was on WJR and he was the voice of the Pistons, and he was a cool guy.
Another Mount Rushmore broadcaster, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And his wife, very cool too. She was very welcoming, and I mean that made it easier. That made it a less of a difficult transition. But it was hard to navigate because it was one of those. It was a new role for me, and so I had to get my footing all over again and sort of start again. So
I do want to ask you one aspect of it, because it wasn't just at Riff. You've done mornings at several other radio stations, and I did a morning show for a few years, and I have to tell you, because I always say we work in the toy department. We're not digging ditches. We work in the toy department.
Yes,
and even though it was a radio job, to get up and have to be at the station at 4 or 5:30 at the latest, I'm sure. How did you get used to that? Because for me, I mean, I'm not a night owl anymore, but when we're doing the morning show, I'd go to bed 12 at 1 and then have to get up at 4. And I can't imagine doing that as long as you did. How did you do it?
I really don't know to this day how I did it, but I can't sleep in, even though I have the opportunity to now. So it's one of those things where you have to force yourself, and get up. And I mean, I guess ambition drives you to get out of bed and make yourself do it and, be awake. And, I went through, I was pregnant part of the time, and, that makes it even more difficult. And, but you have to just get up and do it. I was never one of those people who could stay out till all hours and kind of do a show, but I did have a lot of opportunities to host like during a school night, riff nights out at
Yeah.
bars and stuff like that, where, the the account executive was trying to get you to like stay a little longer, and you're like, oh man, I got to get home.
Well, another thing that I wanted to ask you, and I always got a kick out of this when people would ask me about, worrying about being late for a morning show. I always say, hey, when you go to work, are you stressed about being late? Yes. Imagine if you were late and everybody knows that you're late. You can't hide. You can't have somebody punch in for you. If you are supposed to be on the air at 6 a.m. and you're not there, everybody who's listening knows you're late. And that's some stress. Let me tell you, that's some stressful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. But, Screamin' Scott was always there as backup. In fact, it was his job on Rip to call Mike Clark and get him out of bed. But you're right about that. If you're late, you're late. It's something that the morning show came to call Jacina-ing in, because at one point, I think Drew heard Roberta Jacina, who I think we suspect she was also late, but she was doing a report from her car about road conditions, and in a genius move in order to cover up the fact that she maybe was blowing in a little late.
That's
so
funny.
That stuck, and she's brilliant. And you know what? I was really sorry to see her go, because she's great newscaster. But we invented the word Jacina-ing in, which means that the show has already begun and you kind of slide into the chair and act like you've been there.
Exactly. J.P. McCarthy, there's infamous stories about J.P. rolling into J.R. late.
Oh, yeah?
In 2016, well, that's why his intro was so long, because they would just play his intro till he sat in the chair.
That's a good thing, too, is make the back with music long. Like when the guys maybe went out for a smoke, the back with music was always like Franz Ferdinand or something like that was longer.
Yeah. Oh, the struggle was real. The struggle was real, especially pre-digital.
Yes, it was.
Pre-digital, it was a nightmare. In 2016, Trudi, you got the band back together, so to speak, when you began working with Drew Lane again on the Drew and Mike podcast. How did this opportunity emerge?
They had been doing it for a while and kept inviting me to come to their playground. And, I kind of had to ask permission before I was allowed to do it. And general manager at the time gave permission with a series of conditions. And so, that's when the first time that I, got to join up. And then I couldn't believe that I waited so long. I think I had reservations. Like I wasn't sure whether, it would work out. It was totally unfamiliar doing a podcast. And, once you get in there, all of a sudden you're back with your gang again. And I mean, those guys are, I think I may have said this to you, forgive me if I have, but they are the longest relationship that I've had outside of, with my son. So,
well, it's
a pretty lengthy.
It's no secret that relationships aren't conducive to radio, especially when you're doing a morning
That's
show.
True. Yeah.
My first marriage ended because I was doing a morning show, but that's a whole other matter.
Really?
Now I do want to ask you. Oh yeah, it was a big reason. You have to be. It's part of your life. You talk about your life on the radio, and some people just don't like that. But anyway, how is it different doing the podcast as opposed to what you guys were doing at Riff? Is it the same idea? What's the daily grind like? Is it different?
Well, I think that when you're on a hot mic in a radio station, there's some sort of a governor that keeps you from spitting expletives. And the FCC thing, Chip, is in your head. But you're a lot freer on the podcast. You can kind of do more of, just say whatever, like in the midst of some sort of passionate thing that you have to say, hey, there you are. You can say whatever you want. It also just, I don't know, I feel like way more at ease in that format. So it's sort of freed me to feel more, less constrained and more free to say what I want, or, throw down a wiseacre remark. That part of the social media thing that evolved with us then are the Drew and Mike fans on social media, and they reaffirm you, like they'll say, hey, I heard you say this last night. So that atmosphere, it just fosters it. It's a big circle circle of
Yeah,
life, you might say.
I
But it
like
really
that.
does. They confirm you, and you are validated by them, and you give them back what they give and all that. I feel like listeners on my wheel show are, they're part of the program. And some of the guys that contribute to the show, and sometimes women, um, on a daily basis call me. We're like
How
friends
do you
that I've
like to
never
that
met.
point? How do you, as a news person, it's not something you normally do unless you're talking to a newsmaker. But how are you enjoying working the phones into your show? That's a whole new
I
aspect,
love it.
I'm sure.
I
Yeah.
love it. I mean, I would never do a show without talking to the people who are listening. I mean, you just feel, like untethered, like that Chinese balloon. You're just looming around in a room. And when you've got people calling in, you're connected then. And it's the greatest moment for me too when one of them reacts to something that I said and calls in. It's not like it was when we were doing the morning show that people would call in reaction to what you say, but there are still those kinds of people out there, and I hear from them, and it's like the greatest day I've ever had. When they call. I had a guy call me today who just wanted to request BTO because he
Oh,
used to listen to it with his dad. It reminded him of his dad. And he just happened to be the 10th caller in our free beer giveaway. And I'm like, well, I can give you a free beer too. And he goes, oh no, I don't want to do that. Can you give it to the next person?
oh my
He
gosh!
was like the sweetest person who didn't want to be a prize pig. And I'm like,
Wow.
you've won like two things in the past 2 years, dude. But
Yeah, that's
like talking to
funny.
people like that who have a great story to tell, like it used to be something I listened to my dad with, and it affected me. And when I hear those things, it really gets me. It's great. It humanizes radio, and it's so necessary.
Well, I'll take this opportunity to share my fandom because, to be honest with you, I've admired your work for a long time because not only were you entertaining on Drew and Mike, but when I got into radio, which was in 2000, I started as a news reporter, started working as a news director, and doing that created some opportunities for myself doing morning shows. It was kind of like, but on smaller markets. But anyway, one of my favorite
Yeah.
filmmakers is Quentin Tarantino, and the
Oh
big
yeah.
reason for it is because his editor, who's no longer with us, I don't know if you have ever heard of Sally Minky. Sally Minky was his editor. Howard Tarantino's gone on record to say his only true collaborator is Sally Minky. She was the one that edited all his films. And so I've
Really?
always admired her. And so my biggest role models in movies is her. And in radio, I just have always loved how now don't get me wrong, I don't have that, as Ken Calvert would say, I don't have that tasty voice that Trudi Daniels has in a female type of version,
Oh no,
as it
you have
were.
good radio voice though.
Well, but it's something you learn to do. But my point is I've always enjoyed the way you did things, the way you presented yourself, and you seem, I don't know how you do it, but you make it seem so flawless and easy. You're so natural at it, and I guess one of my favorite quotes is from Ray, and they ask in the movie, they ask Jamie Foxx's character, how do you do what you do? How do you play the piano? And Ray Charles goes, I just do what it do, baby. And so I imagine I'm going to get the same kind
Yeah.
of answer from you. But how did you develop your style? I mean, because you are very good at relaying, whether you're doing the news or your air shift. You're very good on the air, and I think sometimes that goes unnoticed.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. No, I appreciate that. I kind of second what Ray has to say. It comes through you, but not for having. I remember my first job in Toledo. I would do news, and then I would go home and like lay in bed and go, boy, I could have said that better. I could have done something like that. So
Yeah.
I did a whole critique in my head of what I was doing, and then like just determined to try to top it and be better at it. I I also I mean the facts are lost these days, but I would go to great lengths to research something before I talked about it. I remember trying to read the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is ridiculously complex, but just to find out about one particular thing that I was interested in and justify, a story
Yeah.
that I was doing. So, but yeah, it's and a lot of how I feel like I do my job comes through comedy that I watch. I mean, I'm a fan of the way people write on television. It gives me an excuse to watch television for a living. It's part of my job, and movies. And I read a lot. I was, like a big science fiction head back when I was growing up. I just did nothing but read science fiction. So,
well, you know what? I'm gonna
so
segue this into this because
nerd.
doing research. I'm sorry. Say that again.
Just kind of a nerd too, and a big, like car nerd and all kinds of, atypical things for women.
It's funny that you said this because someone told me while I was prepping for this interview with you that you were a bit of a space nerd. Is this true? And maybe
Yeah.
if
Yes.
so, could you tell me how that came to be? What's that about?
Oh, my dad worked for NASA, so
Oh, okay. The plot thickens. I have questions
yeah,
now. Go on.
yeah. It just captured my imagination because he worked for NASA, and we would always watch space launches together. And I had kind of oh, hey, my dad is part of that. He worked for NASA, mind you, a test facility in Sandusky, Ohio. It's far from Cape Canaveral, but he actually did get when he passed away and I was cleaning out his house, I found like a plaque that he had received from the director of, I guess they all got from the director of NASA at the time for his participation in the Apollo missions. So
Wow, that's cool.
It
That's
just,
cool.
it was fascinating. Yeah. And he used to take us out there. They would have company picnics and stuff. And the research facility there in Sandusky was really weird and ominous. And they did have a big nuclear reactor out there that's since been, like they have to like decommission it. But yeah, it was cool. It was like otherworldly. So
My
who
first
said I
job,
was a space nerd?
Ken Calvert. I told him I wasn't going to throw him under the bus, but Ken Calvert told me that. All right.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm glad that he noticed that about me.
See, now I'm feeling guilty about that. Anyway, I do want to ask you this question because this is fascinating to me. One of my first jobs in radio, actually my first job in radio, was I answered phones for Joe Gannon, the appliance doctor at JR. And one of the things
nice.
he taught me, it was cool. And one of the things he taught me is he said, treat celebrities like they're everyday people and treat everyday people like they're celebrities, and you'll be successful in this business. So I say that to ask you this: have you ever been in the presence of an artist and or celebrity that you just like had to control yourself not to be like a fangirl?
Oh God,
so to
every
speak?
time. If I admire someone, I'm then like I'm tongue tied. I can't. I mean, it's easier now, but I remember meeting Stevie Ray Vaughan, and I was so in love with his music, and I couldn't really say anything. And it was great because he's shy and he couldn't say anything either. So we took a picture, and and I loved him through his music. And Jimmy Kimmel came to the radio station one time. He's one of those people, though. He understands that, he practices that, and he treats everyone like they're celebrities too.
Yeah.
And he was cool. And I remember him asking me, he goes, so they make you sit down in this other room down here? Why aren't you in the big room?
Can't even sit in the big room.
Wow. He's observant. Yeah, he knows. Well, I mean, he worked in radio, so he knows what it's like. Hey, I wanted to say, though, your Tarantino love, something about Quentin Tarantino. He knows someone named Trudi. I know this for a fact because, of course, Trudi was in Pulp Fiction.
Yes.
The chick with the stuff in her face.
Yes.
And in Once Upon a Time, what is it? Once Upon a Time in
Once upon a
Hollywood.
time in Hollywood, yeah.
There's a scene of a director's chair, in the set that they were working on, and the girl's name was Trudi. And I was like, who does he know? Who's Trudi?
Could be you. Who knows?
I get excited when I see my name places because it's really
it's
not
spelled
very,
right too. It's spelled with an I as well, isn't it? Isn't it spelled with an I? Yeah. Yeah. They spelled it correctly.
It is.
All right. So my next question is as I only have a couple more for you. We talked about a couple that you mentioned there, but who out of all the countless interviews that you've done with artists and other celebrities, do you have one or two that you're most proud of, and why?
Joe Walsh, again, love Joe Walsh, and he was as fun as we talked to him when he was in the studio back on the Drew and Mike show, but then he circled around and I got to talked to him when I was on CSX, and he was great. And Drew prompted me with a question to ask him about who did the mouth thing first, him or Peter Frampton. And he was like all over it saying, oh, hell, that was me. He stole it from me. He was just
That's
great.
awesome.
He had really, no boundaries. You could ask him anything. And I loved that conversation. But thank God for Drew, because I would never ask any questions if it were up to me. Just recently, Todd Rundgren, then I had like an entire teenage love affair with Todd Rundgren, and finally, got him on the air this past year. And it was fun talking to Todd, too. And I actually confessed to him how much I loved him, which I don't think he knew how to process. I think a lot of people have loved Todd, so he's used to it.
From your perspective, what is the current state of radio, and what do you think radio needs to do to be more attractive to listeners?
I don't know. The current state of radio, I mean, from my perspective, where I sit, I have fun doing my show, and I'm able to get what I want into it. I feel knowledgeable about the artists, and so I can talk about them without, sounding phony. And, talking to people on the air. I just feel comfortable in that format. It is, it's not like you can spend a half an hour talking with anybody at any point anymore. That's just not the way radio is. But I guess I would love for them to do, Metallica is coming here in November, and they're going to do two no repeat shows. I would love to have no repeat weekend or no repeat shows one day a week, where you play, all, songs, never repeat a song the entire day. And just, it would expand what we're listening to so much more. And I just think that I think it's, very tightly programmed for a great reason. I understand why. But it would be nice to, just play something unexpected.
Right. What does the future hold for Trudi Daniels?
Well, okay, my secondary profession would have been dolphin training, so maybe I'm just going to take up living in the Florida Keys and
Now you're talking.
swim all day. I don't know. The immediate future is here, and I love Michigan. I didn't particularly think I'd end up here, but I really understand, how cool this state is, having lived, even in comparison to California. And I just, I think I'm going to stick around for a while and see what happens. Kind of always thought at some point you'd, see some sort of graceful exit, but I haven't seen anything, any opportunity to hit the exits yet, so...
Well, we're not ready for you to leave, so thank you for being and continuing doing what you do, and I'll keep listening.
My
Trudi,
pleasure.
I want to thank you for coming on.
Thanks.
Trudi, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your story. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Fun being on. You ask great questions.
That's nice. That's very nice. Thank you again to Trudi Daniels, and thank you for checking out Radio Dayz the Podcast. Today's show was brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group. Are you looking to buy or refinance your home and have questions that need answers now? Call Brian Allure, 810-444-6466. Today's show is produced by Ron Robinson Studios. If you need professional marketing videos, photography, headshots, maybe you need drone video, head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com. You can also hear previous episodes of Radio Dayz the Podcast there as well. And also, if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming documentary series about the history of radio, Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio, click on the Radio Dayz the Movie under the Documentaries tab at ronrobinsonstudios.com. Thanks for checking out the show. Thanks again to Trudi, and we'll see you next time. Until next time.
You can't go! All the plants are gonna die!